but I'm still going to use it as an aid. Thank you, Shani. Thank you, Rivi. Even though we're now called Reichman University, we're still an interdisciplinary institution, so you've been very gracious to invite some recovering lawyers such as myself and some real political scientists such as Maus Rosenthal. That will hopefully be stimulating and enrich the legal conversation that is the lion's share of this conference. So I'm essentially going to do sort of three things as briefly as I can. So we have as much. We're also going to have some time for conversation, I presume, right? That Shani will moderate. I'll make very brief framing remarks about the current global democratic recession that we're experiencing, and specifically the notion of toxic polarization that we're experiencing. Then I will present to you what is the dominant and I think empirically convincing paradigm that we have for thinking about the relationship between political regimes and political violence. Yeah, there's a long literature that sort of begins to emerge already in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Are democracies or dictatorships more vulnerable to political violence, and how do we sort of think about vulnerability to political violence of different types of political regimes? Okay, and there's a genealogy there. There's a long story. I won't get into the different phases of this literature, but I will present the latest available and I think generally convincing, even if dynamic, paradigm for how we think about that relationship. And then what I'll do is I'll end with four sort of questions. And I guess what I should have done in my title is to sort of put a question mark. Rather than to state this as a definitive, that democratic backsliding is pushing us into the danger zone of increased political violence. I think that's intuitively correct. But the truth is that we don't have very robust empirical examinations of that relationship in the context of the contemporary world. I think that there's a number of things going on now that are very likely to influence the relationship between political regimes and political violence, and we don't have a very good grip on the empirical relationship. So what I'm going to present is sort of a series of questions, perhaps for us to think about, and perhaps for us to think about as a sort of a future-oriented research agenda. Okay, so very briefly, and this I'm sure is familiar to or intuitive to all of us, we are currently living through what Samuel Huntington, the late Samuel Huntington, would have called the third reverse wave of global democracy and dictatorship. In 1992, Samuel Huntington published a famous book. Huntington published several famous books, and one of them is called The Third Wave of Democracy and Dictatorship, in which Huntington identified the spread of democratic regimes in the international system that begins in the middle to late 19th century. We then have the first reverse wave with the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 1920s and 30s. After the Allied victory of the Second World War, we have sort of a second wave in the spread of democracy in the international system. We also have the birth of many more states in the international system. So we have this boost. You know, Israel is born, India is born, Pakistan is born, etc. Right? A lot of post-colonial states, and we have a boost for the number of democracies in the world. We then experience a second reverse wave in the middle to late 1960s, early 1970s, and since the Revolução dos Cravos, the Carnation Revolution of 1974, a la Huntington, we have been living in a third and for the first time globalized global democratic boom, okay, that really takes off in a dramatic way with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. So just to give you a sort of a reference, in 1942, there are 12 electoral democracies left on the face of the planet. Churchill and FDR exchanging letters lamenting the death of freedom and democracy. In 1974, We have 39 electoral democracies on the face of the planet, which constitute 27% of all the political regimes in the world at the time. By the year 2000, we have 123 electoral democracies in the world, which constitute somewhere between 63–64% of countries in the world. So we reach a certain sort of peak of the global democratic boom between the year 2000 and 2005, and since 2006, we have been on a gradually accelerating global democratic recession. Okay? Now that in itself is not unusual, right? Huntington would have told us that after a global democratic boom, we should expect some kind of reverse, right? Because we had a very large number of rather fragile states becoming, at the very least, electoral democracies, if not fully consolidated liberal democracies. So an actual reverse wave wouldn't have been a huge surprise to us, right? The fact that Fiji might backslide, or that Ghana or that Thailand might experience a democratic breakdown wouldn't have been sort of a huge surprise. What has come as an enormous shock to people who deal in the study of political regimes and people who are committed liberal internationalists, if you like, has been the emergence of democratic backsliding, democratic erosion, or what we call in the literature autocratization, not within new and fragile democracies, but what were until very recently seemed to be the bedrock, the heart, the core of the liberal democratic world, especially the United States of America, which is seen as the liberal hegemon undergirding the entire sort of global environment that is supportive of broadly liberal democratic principles. In Europe, the big surprise has been the failure of the European Union to ensure compliance with the Copenhagen criteria, and the phenomena that we've seen that post-accession countries like Hungary and Poland have been reverting towards authoritarianism. So that was sort of a big shock, and it meant that it's really, over the last few years, that political scientists are really trying to sort of grapple with that and trying to understand, you know, what the hell is going on and what do we do with this phenomena. And the agenda for this conference, I think, represents the new frontier for democratization studies, or rather regime-type studies, where, having understood what appears to be going on, a real danger to the basic integrity, particularly of American democracy, people are now beginning to ask, what do we do about it? What tools do we have for trying to make sure that the United States does not go in the way that Weimar Germany went in the 1920s and 1930s. Very briefly, we essentially, in democratization studies, have three sets of answers for how can democracies defend themselves. Okay? One comes from the Tocquevillian, Harendian tradition, right? It's about mores, it's about norms, it's about values, and as Hannah Arendt famously argued, a mere constitution will not save you. Laws as good and as legitimate as they may be will not save you, because at the end of the day, a democracy will live or die depending on the behavior of elites and the support or lack of support of key constituencies in the polity for the behavior of elites, right? So it's really about values, norms, mores, okay? A second branch says no. I mean, institutions matter, constitutions matter, right? For all the reasons that Mark, you spoke about at dinner last night. Constitutions structure our expectations and they shape the nature of politics, etc. And so we should look to constitutions and legal mechanisms, including criminal legal mechanisms, to make sure that democracy is not a suicide pact, and that we preserve the political order that is called liberal democracy. There's a third branch, which sadly the United States has exempted itself from, which is a whole range of regional and global legal mechanisms and tools that are meant to prevent democratic sliding and the breakdown of democracy. So if you are a member of the European Union, you are subject to the famous Article 7 of the Treaty of Lisbon that says you can only be a member in good standing as long as you respect the foundational values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of Lisbon that require you to be a democracy, to respect the rule of law, to respect minority rights, and so on and so forth. If you are a member of the Organization of American States in Latin America, there are mechanisms that are sort of anti-coup or anti-democratic breakdown set of mechanisms. They don't always work. It also depends on enforcement. We can see the weakness of the mechanisms in the European Union when it comes to Poland and Hungary, and yet you have a set of norms, of democracy clauses, of human rights clauses that are supposed to prevent democratic breakdown. The United States, as the indispensable nation, the exceptional nation, is not really subject to those types of regimes. Okay, I want to say a word about toxic polarization, because when we sort of try to understand how is democratic breakdown in 2022 different from, let's say, the wave of military coups that we've experienced in the 1960s or 70s, the notion of toxic polarization, I think, is useful. The idea that today democracy doesn't break down as a result of overt military coups and violence, but as a result of the emergence internally of elites that refuse to play by the constitutional, by the democratic rules of the game, the rise of anti-pluralist, if you like, populist political parties that then corrode or erode the deliberate components of democracy. And this is how sort of VDEM, for example, tries to measure this idea of toxic polarization. And if you look at the latest VDEM report, they would observe a very substantial rise in the number of countries in the world experiencing this type of erosion in the deliberative component of liberal democracy. And this tends to be, it's not always empirically perfectly in line with declines in standards of the rule of law, freedom of expression, and trust in the integrity of elections, but they tend to sort of go together. And that gives you a sense of what we mean by toxic polarization. Okay, I move on to the second component. I'll do that very briefly. In summarizing a lot of literature, we essentially can think about the relationship between political regimes and political violence as reflected in this kind of simple bell curve, where the greatest proclivity, the greatest vulnerability to political violence sort of exists in the middle, right? The idea would be that if you're a very closed, very authoritarian political regime, North Korea, you do not allow mobilization and organization outside of the ruling state, right? So there's no scope for effective organization and mobilization and even communication that would permit the emergence of non-state actors that would challenge the monopoly, the Gewaltmonopol, right? The monopoly over the means of violence of the state, right? But as you liberalize, okay, and most authoritarian regimes are not North Korea. Most authoritarian regimes look a lot more like Iran or like Israel. I'll ignore that for now. I'll get to the backsliding danger. Okay, but you get the idea. So the idea is that when you sort of look at patterns of political violence, and this is true of terrorism, but it's also true of essentially true of civil wars. And if you want to follow this up, have a look at the article by Jones and Lupu called "Is There More Violence in the Middle?" from the American Journal of Political Science, and it's a great summary of the state of the art. So as you liberalize, the risk of political violence rises, and the most dangerous political regime to be in terms of vulnerability to political violence are what we call competitive authoritarian regimes or liberalized authoritarian regimes. Okay, but my point would be to Professor Ael that actually if we disaggregate, I did this here with terrorist attacks, but if we disaggregate, and this is sort of post 9/11 figures on global terrorism. So if we disaggregate the global numbers that we have on terrorist attacks to different types of political regimes, you will see, and this might be counterintuitive to some people, that actually liberal democracies and polyarchies, which are slightly less sort of high-quality liberal democracies, suffer relatively few terrorist attacks, and it's really these multi-party autocracies, but also electoral democracies and minimalist democracies that suffer much higher levels of political violence. This could also, we could see this not just in terms of incidents, but in terms of casualties. There seems to be a democracy advantage in terms of relatively reduced number of incidents, although we've seen an increase in the number of terrorist attacks post 9/11 globally for all political regimes. But it seems to be that liberal democracies and polyarchies are relatively safer from these hybrid regimes. Okay, so 4 points for us to consider, and I'll just enumerate them and then stop. Liberal democracies and polyarchies do appear to benefit from a substantial and in many respects growing democracy advantage. They experience relatively fewer incidents. We've seen the lowest level of increase post 9/11 among them, and they appear to be better at avoidance of mass casualties. Okay, we can also ask why. However, simply clearing the minimal or electoral democracy threshold does not provide you with a meaningful democracy advantage. You have to be a high-quality liberal democracy or polyarchy to really enjoy the democracy advantage when it comes to the avoidance of large-scale political violence, civil wars, and terrorism. Now, if we are indeed in a new era of democratic recession, we should expect more and more countries to be entering this kind of danger zone of increased risk of terrorism and civil war. Is this actually happening in practice? I think it's just too early to say. Perhaps there are other variables, but when we look at what happened in the United States, we look at risks of political violence in the United States, I think it's fair to say that they are higher today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And then, I don't think we really yet understand the relationship between toxic polarization and populism and political violence. I think it's an open question that we need to think about much more. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.